Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll start our next press conference now. If you're here from the Cannes press conference, please remain. I think you'll be very glad that you did. The organization that I represent, or one of the organizations I represent, is the United Planet Faith and Science Initiative. We were sponsored here by the Abibiman Foundation and the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. Abibiman is in Africa and the ICSD is in Jerusalem. And today our press conference will focus on science and economics. My name is Stuart Scott. I'm the founder of the United Planet Faith and Science Initiative. And with me today is Paul Beckwith, a professor of geography from the University of Ottawa. His areas are climatology and meteorology, and he researches abrupt climate change, past and present. And the topic that we'll be discussing today focuses on the Arctic methane emergency. And we have some very grave information to share with you for those of you who are not familiar with this subject, this aspect of climate change. Now, a few days ago, there was an article that appeared in the New York Times online, and I took note of it. It was sent to me by a friend, because to me it was a milestone, really. The second paragraph reads, "Even with a deal to stop the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, scientists warn the world will become increasingly unpleasant." And the journalist went on to say, "Without a deal, they say the world could eventually become uninhabitable for humans." Now, as usual, we are just focused on ourselves, on human life, and ignoring the fact that we depend upon other life for our own survival. And I want to make it clear that, in my view, and I think implicit in the views of many of you, is the fact that what we are negotiating here is not a deal so much between the global north and the global south, as much as we are negotiating a deal between life on Earth, the well-being of life on Earth, and money. This is implicit in the press conferences that you will hear up here often. The last press conference that we followed upon from Cannes, where they point out the specific areas where moneyed forces are opposing progress. But I want to make it very much clearer in the presentation that I'll give you today, and I'll return to the subject of money and economics. But let's go to the Arctic. This is a view of the polar ice cap in late summer, when it's at its minimum in late summer of 1980. Here's one data point just a few years later, in 2007. And lest you think I'm cooking the data, here is the record, where each color represents a different month of the year, late summer being the lowest. And recently, scientists began to realize that they could no longer plot the decline of ice in a linear manner because it was behaving in an exponential manner. The Arctic sea ice is decaying exponentially, and it may disappear in summer, late summer completely, as soon as next year. Sometime between next year and 2020 is most likely, we believe. Returning to the Arctic region, I want to point your attention to that area, a submerged shelf off of Siberia that is approximately 70 meters, about 200 feet below water. During ice ages past, it was above water, and there was abundant life there at times. And now that life is decomposed under the sediments of that East Siberian Arctic shelf and has turned into something else. Here's another view, a map view of the East Siberian Arctic shelf. And as you'll read the caption, it says that that shallow ledge of submerged sea shelf is estimated to contain between 500 and 5,000 gigatons, billion tons of methane, a huge amount. To give you a sense of the magnitude, there are approximately 5 gigatons of methane in the atmosphere of Earth today. And we are talking about from hundreds to thousands of times that amount contained in that one shallow ledge. What you're seeing on this slide is the release of methane from one of several hundred plumes that were discovered when explorations went up there in 2007. And the notation that methane is approximately 86 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. Now, you will see variation in that number for the following reason. When the methane is emitted, it's estimated to be above 150 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. Over 150 times as powerful. However, the methane begins to decay when it's exposed to air, and it becomes H2O and CO2. So it decays to a less impactful form of a greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, but it does so slowly. So the 86 number is the number I've seen over a 20-year period. That number is represented as approximately 23 over a 100-year period. That is, during the first year, it's extremely dangerous, and it becomes less dangerous over time. Now, watch the methane. We're not getting sound from this slide, unfortunately. Thank you. Those were students in Alaska whose teacher had brought them out on a frozen lake, because it happens in lakes as well. The sediments of the lake, which contain organic material, the organic material, when it's digested in an anaerobic environment, becomes methane instead of CO2. And so kids have found that it's fun to go and poke holes in the ice and light that on fire. It's kind of Arctic fireworks. But it represents something very, very serious to those of us who understand what it means, because it is such a potent greenhouse gas.
So for the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a joint Russian-Alaskan expedition going out into the Siberian Sea and observing this, and they've been seeing great plumes of methane bubbling up all over the East Siberian Sea. The whole zone of millions of square miles of territory is now releasing all of its methane cover.
Millions of square miles is now releasing all of its methane cover. That's Dr. Peter Wadhams, and we'll return to Dr. Wadhams in a few slides from now. Dr. Natalia Shakova leads a team of scientists, joint American-Russian scientific team, studying conditions on the East Siberian Arctic shelf. Here are her words.
So the methane in the atmosphere, the total amount of methane in the atmosphere, in the current atmosphere, it's about 5 gigatons. The amount of carbon preserved in form of methane in this Siberian Arctic shelf is approximately from hundreds to thousands of gigatons. And of course, it's only 1% of that amount is required to double the atmospheric burden of methane. But to destabilize 1% of this carbon pool, I think it's not much effort needed, considering that the state of permafrost and the amount of methane currently involved.
And one more remark from Dr. Shakova.
Shortly speaking, we do not like what we see there. Absolutely do not like.
Now, Dr. Shakova and her team estimate the volume of methane currently being released at approximately 50 gigatons. That is 50 billion tons of methane. It's a pure estimate. There is no way of knowing. It could be vastly more. The question of how quickly, we don't know. Now, that 50 gigatons would represent 10 times the methane content of Earth's atmosphere today, and would more than double the Earth's burden of greenhouse gases, including CO2. That is, we would go from a 400 parts per million CO2 world to the equivalent of 800 to 1,000 parts per million. Now,
at the moment we have to rely on Shakova and Semiletov, who've been doing that work, and they have then expert knowledge of the seabed conditions, and they're the ones who are estimating the 50 gigatons. So that could be revised up or down if further work is done in that area.
And do you think civilization could survive a 50 gigaton release of methane?
No, I don't think it can. I think that if you look at the existing predictions of global warming rates, what's kind of eerie is the fact that the business as usual projections, even the cautious ones produced by IPCC, are still giving us about 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, and with 2 degrees has been taken arbitrarily as the level beyond which nasty things happen. I don't know why it's 2 degrees, but that will be reached by the middle of the century, and 4 degrees by the end of the century. Now, 4 degrees, people who've calculated what that would do to food production, to die-off of forests, to acceleration of warming due to various extra feedbacks that kick in, that the general conclusion is pretty dire, that if you get to 4 degrees of warming, then collapse of civilization is what's going to happen, because the world won't be able to sustain anywhere near its present population. So the result will be chaos and warfare. So that's just that. The eerie thing is that that's predicted by the IPCC report, but the projection of warming by the end of the century is 4 degrees. But nowhere do they state at all that 4 degrees is a catastrophe for economically and socially for the planet. And now with this Arctic methane, you're simply adding another element to the warming, even if it's only an extra 0.6. That brings forward the date at which catastrophic warming is achieved by maybe 20 years.
this is from one of the world's foremost authorities on the Arctic sea ice, Dr. Wadhams from Cambridge University. Now, here you see 2 polar views of our planet. On the left, the methane detected November of 2008, and on the right, November 2012. This is the millions of square miles of territory now releasing its methane cover. And I'll call your attention to the scientists who collaborated on this report, an American, a Russian, and a Chinese scientist, and in particular to Dr. Ira Leifer. And I have a quote from Dr. Ira Leifer for you next in 3 parts. Some scientists are indicating we should make plans to adapt to a 4-degree centigrade hotter world. While prudent, one wonders what portion of the population could adapt to such a world. My view is that it's just a few thousand people seeking refuge in the Arctic or Antarctica. Very grave consequences we face from our actions. Here is what's known as a methane veil that's spreading southward from the Arctic. The red at the top, well, first the yellow background, is 1750 to 1850 parts per billion. The orange, which is spreading from the methane release in the Arctic, is 1850 to 1950. And the red is above 1950, with a peak having been recorded in January of this year at almost 2,400 parts per billion. To give you some frame of reference for what that compares to, pre-industrial methane levels are estimated to have been about 720 parts per billion. So we've already gone 2.5 times the pre-industrial level. And again, methane is 150 times as powerful a greenhouse gas when it's first emitted. Now let's look at the consequences of that. What you're seeing here is a map of the world. This was compiled by the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in 2012. And it details the drought conditions in the first decade of this century. The next 3 slides will go to the 1/3 point, the two-thirds point, and the final decade of this century. Keep your eyes on the colors red. 2030 through 39, 2060 through 69, and 2090 through 99. And it goes from red off the scale through purple and violet and to finally white. In the vernacular, the Mediterranean is toast. The heartland of the United States is toast. The ability of the world to provide food will be concentrated in just a few areas, mostly in northern China, Russia, Canada, and Alaska. That will be for feeding a population of 7 to 9 billion people, perhaps. Now, from this, you have to go to a realization, I believe. The realization that I want to bring you all to is that the operating system of global civilization is seriously flawed. Now, no one ever taught you in school that we have an operating system, but we do, in fact. And that operating system is known by two names: money and economics. It's in our language. Money makes the world go round, the bottom line. Everywhere you look, in our language, in our reality, in our human reality, money is running the show. In particular, it's known as neoclassical economics, and the name neoclassical has dropped out of the record because for the past 100 years, the neoclassical economists have held sway over the economies of Earth. And so it's no longer neoclassical economics to us, it's just economics, as though there were no alternative. Well, there is an alternative. Now, again, we are turning neoclassical economics, which has harnessed human ingenuity, is turning nature, the natural world, into money as quickly as possible. There's a concept known as a meme, a viral thought form. Money is a meme, and the meme of money has promoted to the highest positions of authority in government and in business those who are best at ignoring the consequences of their actions and best at maximizing the bottom line, creating the most money, the most shareholder value. We have a seriously flawed operating system. Our economic system will kill us. Unfortunately, like a virus that invades your body, the virus has no concept that it is killing its host. Money is killing the host, but humanity is the host. And when humanity disappears, money disappears. And until we see our predicament in these terms, we have very little hope of overcoming the predicament. There is an alternative life-affirming economic system called ecological economics, of course. Unless your economic system starts with a presumption that the human economy exists within a finite ecosphere and has to dissipate its wastes into that ecosphere without overwhelming the ability of nature to absorb our wastes. Unless you come to that realization, you're working with an untenable economic system. Here is Dr. Herman Daly, who is known as the founder of ecological economics. He worked for the World Bank for 8 years until he quit because the World Bank at that point in time had not gotten it. Now they're getting it, but they are still not willing to conceptualize, or not able, excuse me, to conceptualize that they have to break from neoclassical economics. There's still this belief that we can grow the GDPs, national, global, grow, corporate. We cannot. There is nothing that can grow forever within a finite container. Now, I want to introduce you to a notion of a carbon bubble, and if you haven't heard of it, and this is the flaw that is going to break our economic system, perhaps, whether or not it is willing to change. The science of the AR5, the IPCC's assessment report 5, says that in order to stay below 2 degrees centigrade of global warming, from 66% per the IPCC report to 80%, per the International Energy Agency, of all fossil fuel reserves of all companies and nations on Earth are unburnable. If we are to save our planet and humanity from runaway climate change, we have to write off what is estimated to be 28, I'm sorry, the number is wrong there, trillion dollars. I'll have to correct my slide. $28 trillion of stranded fossil fuel assets. And as investors wake up to the huge risk involved in owning fossil fuel stocks, the bubble in those overpriced stocks will begin to burst. This will happen. Sooner if we're lucky, later if we are unfortunate. This is called the carbon bubble. We don't know how soon it will happen, but there are many, many, many of us working to make it come sooner. Again, there's the correction. It's $28 trillion of losses. And there's the carbon bubble at a demonstration in the Wall Street area of Manhattan. Now, one of the ways that it is being burst is by many universities and other fiduciaries around the world, those who hold the money of others in trust. In particular, here's the website of the University of Hawaii's divestment organization, which I helped design. And it points out that endowments, pension funds, mutual funds, estates, trusts, 401ks, if you have your money in any collective vehicle, then it is invested in fossil fuels unless you've taken special measures to divest your money, to invest it in divested fiduciaries. And I predict that all fossil fuel stocks owned by all fiduciaries are liable to crash in value by 60 to 80%, and those divesting early will avoid the worst. Now, there's my email if you'd like to get in touch. And I'd like at this point to introduce Paul Beckwith, who will take the remaining time to discuss the Arctic methane problem a bit more.
Hello. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. It's not like Las Vegas. The extreme Arctic warming amplification, which is occurring because the Arctic sea ice and the Arctic snow cover in the spring are declining exponentially. Thus, the very white and highly reflective snow and ice is being replaced by dark seawater, which is very strongly reflecting of solar energy, causing the Arctic to warm much, much faster than any part of the planet. So what this is doing is this is destabilizing the atmospheric air circulation and ocean circulation, because it is reducing the temperature gradient or difference between the equator and the pole, which slows down the jet streams, making them wavier. So very warm, humid, southerly air can go much further, go to much higher latitudes than before, and cold Arctic air can go to much more southerly latitudes than before. So this in itself is representing an enormous feedback, a feedback which is called a positive feedback, not positive for us, but a reinforcing feedback, which is carrying more and more heat up into the Arctic and more coldness from the Arctic further south. So what this will do is it will basically fracture the jet streams, and it leads us to a very different world. It leads us to a less predictable world weather-wise. It leads us to a world where weather extremes such as torrential rains and extended droughts and floods become to dominate the weather system. The frequency of these events, the severity of these events, the duration of these events all increase. And these events also occur in regions where we didn't have this before. For example, we get 30 centimeters of snow in the Atacama Desert, which is the driest region of the planet, unprecedented. We get torrential rains where we had desert before. We get desert where we had had moderate temperatures before. This is basically a very different climate system, weather system than we are used to. And this is happening with 0.85 degrees Celsius of warming above the pre-industrial level. This is happening today, now, and this is very dependent on the conditions in the Arctic. So as the Arctic continues to exponentially decline in snow cover and sea ice cover, these extremes will undoubtedly have to increase. The physics of the system says so. We have changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. Because we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, we have changed the weather and climate that occurs in this atmosphere. So what can we do about this? In some of our previous press conferences, we have discussed ways in which we can try to cool the Arctic. For example, using salt spray over the ocean currents and to cool them as they move up into the Arctic. We have looked at things like biochar to store carbon in the soils. And there's many, many things that we can do, but the most important thing is for the public and the policymakers and the world to recognize that a 2-degree target is not what we need to worry about right now. We need to worry about the destabilization and disruption of our climate and weather patterns that are occurring now at 0.85 degrees and deal with them now. Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I have a very brief bit of additional footage from Dr. Johannes Lehmann, who is the world's authority on what is called biochar. It's a carbon negative technology for sequestering carbon while it enhances the fertility of the farmlands in which the char is buried. Dr. Lehmann is from the Cornell University College of Agricultural and Life Science, and he's the foremost authority on biochar, this carbon negative soft technology.
Hello, I'm Johannes Lehmann, Professor of Soil Science at Cornell University. I'm so pleased to address you at a moment where the bilateral agreement on greenhouse gas emission reductions between the US and China has sent a clear signal for action. Specifically today, on World Soil Day, December 5, which kicks off the United Nations International Year of Soils 2015, I'm eager to discuss with you where soil fits into a comprehensive strategy to mitigate climate change. The science is absolutely clear. The global climate is changing faster than anticipated, and we have to do something about it. The silver bullet will prove elusive, and only a concerted international effort will provide us with a chance to mitigate and adapt to climate change by building a deep toolbox of approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it is increasingly becoming clear that reducing emissions alone, while an indispensable prerequisite of any successful mitigation strategy, will not be sufficient, and an active withdrawal of atmospheric carbon dioxide will need to be part of managing climate change through, for example, carbon sequestration. I share the concern expressed by progressive thinkers that a scenario where we are forced to take drastic steps may prove disastrous without having done due diligence on the risks and opportunities of a portfolio of sequestration options. This year's IPCC report made impressive progress in laying out the need for carbon sequestration and provided the first data on what efforts are needed to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide. The principal pathway to achieving this carbon drawdown put forward in the report is bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, or BECCS. The technical feasibility and cost-effective deployment are still not proven. Pilot projects should be put on the road without further delay. However, additional avenues must be explored. pyrolysis bioenergy with biochar return to agricultural soils is a technically feasible approach to start sequestering carbon dioxide now, with little development time to initial deployment needed in comparison to BECCS. Such a strategy would not only remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also be able to restore soil health and increase crop productivity in degraded areas. Applying stringent sustainability criteria to biomass use yields a potential to withdraw 1 gigaton carbon per year from the atmosphere over the coming 100 years using biochar sequestration, with more being possible and less being likely given financial constraints. This may prove the stopgap measure that will allow a safe transition to a low or no emission society. There will be trade-offs between maximizing energy generation by using biomass and sequestering carbon with biochar. This must be stated very clearly. Opportunities and constraints have to be investigated now to be ready when far-reaching decisions about a comprehensive global strategy to carbon sequestration are made. The costs must be evaluated at scale of implementation with a clear pathway to crop yield increases by biochar addition to soil. Which brings me back to my point from the beginning. Do we want to utilize biomass only for energy, or rather a sustainability package that helps transition into climate-smart agriculture? Restoring and maintaining healthy and productive soils should, in my view, be prioritized, especially if it generates the same climate benefits at comparable costs. Thank you for your attention, and a happy World Soil Day.
And thank you all for coming. We are a tiny bit over our time limit, so we'll take questions in the hallway. Thank you.